taking all of your questions and answers related to history and social studies, so please ask me anything and I'll be happy to answer. After finally figuring out some technical difficulties and issues with our lighting system, I am up and running right now, ready to bring you a nice mood and all of that great stuff and talk about history and social studies, answering all your questions related to those topics. So if you have a question, if you like history, then you are in the right place, and consider liking and subscribing and all of that great stuff. And for the next hour or so, I will be answering every question you have regarding history and social studies, the humanities, social sciences, geopolitics, and the like. Hello, Harsonet. Hello, Harry. Good to see you as well. Some of my wonderful, friendly neighborhood historians are here and ready to go with questions and all of that good stuff. Do you think the United States can reindustrialize? If the tariff system does actually work that President Trump is proposing, there might be a possibility of reindustrialization. Obviously, the loss of manufacturing jobs is common in a very hyper-developed economy. It's happening in India and China right now, and it had happened in the United States about 3 or 4 decades ago. So offshoring and outsourcing are signs of a globalistic and globalized economic system, and the United States has had that for a long time. So it's going to be kind of going backwards, kicking and screaming through the terrors of tariffs, but basically the need for domestic products to be made cheaply in the United States because of tariffs will incentivize many corporations and business owners to start creating mechanization and new forms of mechanization and industry. So we might see a resurgence of that in the next 5 years or so. Who knows what that could economic implications that could have, but that's going to take a while. So it's an interesting concept. Obviously, the United States has been the master of production and productivity and dominated it in the 20th century. And then later in the 20th century, as its economy continued to grow, it started to outsource that more and more to other places and other things. So that happened as well. How do you think the changing political demographics of people from blue states to red states, what will be the impact? I was just watching a video today about that, Harsonet, and the truth of the matter is it really looks like a lot of the red states are going to gain in congressional districts, which means they'll gain in electoral votes, which means they'll gain in influence in presidential elections. So it's going to be easier and easier for Republicans to win the presidency and harder for Democrats to do so. Throughout the 2010s and 2000s, it was very common for the Democrats to have the advantage in the electoral vote, with the Republicans kind of having to pull an inside straight by winning Ohio and maybe a state like Pennsylvania. But Trump's expansion of that map and now new purple states that are halfway between red and blue allow for, and the growth of certain areas that are red or purple leaning red will allow the Republicans to have more dominance in elections, especially presidential. So the presidential elections could look very Republican for the foreseeable future. We'll see exactly, unless there's huge demographic shifts back for the Democrats. We'll see what happens in this term of Trump, but it seems to be kind of all over the place. Harsonet's asking, do you think American politics will have to become more moderate, like Reagan traditionalist model? It could be. I think that American politics has hit a huge level of division and what's the word? The tension has gotten to a high pitch, and I think it's going to simmer down maybe after Trump's second term. We don't know exactly. Harry's asking, who do you think was a better society and better for their people, the Romans or the Greeks? Oh, that's a great question, Harry. Thank you for asking. I think the Romans were a powerful society, and I think that rather than impress upon their people their civilization and its culture like the Greeks did in Hellenizing much of the Middle East and North Africa and the areas that they conquered in Alexander the Great's time, the Romans were much better at actually allowing some sort of religious toleration, cultural toleration, as long as people were willing to pay homage to Caesar or to the Roman Republic and to the government and were willing to follow the Roman law. During the time of the Pax Romana, which was when Rome was at its height in the early days of the empire, the area was safe, the borders were secure, the infrastructure was good, the water was sanitary and clean, and the Romans thrived, and the people who lived under them thrived, of all different stripes and classes. So with a lingua franca being Greece, because of the Greek spread throughout the world, the Romans were able to communicate pretty well, and were relatively tolerant of different ideas that they weren't constantly fighting against. So, Spartacus, hello, thank you for joining us. Harsonet, what do you think was a more important invention, antibiotics or camera, video, audio tape devices? I think that's a tough one. An interesting question about which one was more influential, but probably antibiotics. Yeah, I think antibiotics were obviously huge for yeah, whatever. Yeah, I think antibiotics were obviously really important for healing and development. And no, Shiloh, I'm not going to do that. Do you think blue cities like New York, Seattle, and Los Angeles can follow the Texas model of fixing cities? I don't know if they will, even if they learn what that is. Do you think Napoleon should be known as Napoleon the Great? I do sometimes refer to him as Napoleon the Great because there's three Napoleons actually in French history. There's Napoleon II, his son, which he tried to pass off as the French emperor when he was forced to abdicate, and that never really settled in with the French people, so he's not really considered an official ruler of France. And then there's his nephew, Napoleon III, who ruled over the Second French Empire in the 1850s and 60s. And yeah. HVAC was the most important invention. It's an extremely important invention now with everything that it provides for people with indoor air conditioning and internal thermostats and things like that. Do you drink water or soda more? I try to drink water more because it's healthier for you. I guess the high density of sugar in soda and the corn syrup and stuff like that, just not my thing. I mean, I'll drink soda. It's fun to drink. It tastes good, but yeah. I try to drink water more than I drink soda. So yeah. We're in our Ask Me Anything, so if you're just joining us, you can ask me anything related to social studies, the humanities, things like that. Yeah. I think the phone was the most important invention in human history. I would agree with that, Harsonet. Yeah. I think the phone's obviously changed everything, and you look at it, I'm talking to you officially through a phone, using a phone to communicate with you over the internet. Obviously, the internet, I think, might be a close second, or the car. It's really, you're not there are many great options you can select when you consider human technology and inventions that have impacted history and made things different and things like that. So there's communication inventions like the phone, telegraph, and the internet, and there's traveling inventions like railroads, cars, or planes. So who do you think was a better person, Caesar or Octavian, and which one was better for their people? I think Julius Caesar was a little too arrogant, and that's why today, the Ides of March, he was stabbed in 44 BC. And I think if he had just been a little more subtle like Octavian was, although Octavian was extremely brutal, he would have survived longer and probably could have become dictator for life. Octavian was a good leader and kept people in line. And although he could be brutal and quite ruthless, Rome really thrived under Octavian, and he gained land for Rome and all of that. So I would have to say Octavian, or AKA Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. Do you think Trump is the next Calvin Coolidge? Yes, I think Trump is advancing towards that stage of more of an isolationist policy. He's not as much of a free market conservative when it comes to economics as Coolidge was, but he definitely has a lot of those ideas of letting business do their thing, getting rid of regulations, cutting taxes, and of course, getting rid of having less and less to do with foreign affairs and stuff like that. So, yeah. Would it be right to say luxuries have become cheaper and necessities have become more expensive? Both, the ideal is that both become cheaper, and I think luxuries have become cheaper, but some luxuries have become necessities. Obviously, Henry Ford turned the car from a luxury into a necessity because it became the obvious way American people wanted to transport themselves and travel around and stuff like that. Yes, Octavian was known by that because he technically adopted himself as Caesar's son. So claiming that he was Caesar's son and that Caesar was a god, he called himself the son of God. And the good news that the emperor was spreading from one city to another was called the Evangelion, or the gospel. So that's actually where those Christian terms come from. So Jesus of Nazareth's usage of them and his followers' attribution of those titles to him is actually extremely intentional and anti-imperial by the earliest Christians in the 1st century AD. By the way, I use BC and AD instead of BCE and CE because BCE and CE, although are more politically correct, and more inclusive, and are not created by the Christian Church, refer to the exact same date. It is all centered around the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the Christian Messiah, and God. So that's so therefore they're really kind of redundant to me at some point, because they are actually for calendar attributions, they are based in the exact same principle as BC and AD anyways. So might as well use the older, more traditional one, especially when talking about historical events. So that's why I use BC and AD. I'll use BCE and CE sometimes, but really the common era starts when Jesus was born. It's centered around the same year. So unless you can come up with a system that's a little bit better than that, I'm not going to be using any other than the BC AD model that's popular in the West. What's the history of Bitcoin? Bitcoin comes into existence, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s. and it was extraordinarily cheap, and nobody knew what it was. And obviously, it has ballooned in size and value, and is part of a cryptocurrency movement that is trying to create an alternate form of currency that could make the world cashless. And even creditless to some extent. It's like it's what credit cards and ATMs were in the 1950s and 60s and stuff like that. And Octavian was hated for most of his early career, while Caesar was nearly always the most popular politician while he was alive and years after his death. Yes, but Octavian wasn't stabbed to death by a bunch of senators, including his best friend, because he was wiser than Caesar. He was wiser than his uncle. He learned from his uncle's mistakes and knew how to play the game of politics and manipulate people. Julius definitely got arrogant and went on his own way with that. So, yeah. Anyways, thank you for joining us at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. If you are enjoying what you're learning about and you like learning about history, you're in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing and becoming a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. It's as easy as that. So, yeah, if you have a question or a topic or a comment you'd like to bring up, I'd be happy to answer them in a friendly neighborhood manner. Do you agree that after World War II, people gradually started to focus on cutting expenses and maximizing profits in America? Yes. In fact, maximizing profits and the growth of the GDP and the modern economy was heavily buoyed and ballooned thanks to the intervention of women in the labor force, equal pay rights, minimum wage, things like this helped grow the amount of money people would have, and because of that, made it easier for people to produce more money and wealth to be more distributed because you had more people available in the workforce as it became more and more societally appropriate for women to participate in work at the same rate as men. Tell me why Snape is black in Harry Potter. Well, that's the new Harry Potter series. I don't know why. Obviously, all of the figures are from the mind of a British lady and are British in their origin, and most British people are white. You have Africans who live in Britain. People of Jamaican ancestry obviously share a heritage with the British and the Americans and the Canadians, so there's that too. Not going to lie, the 1920s Act was the best choice for America. Wasn't the best choice for America. What do you mean by that? And by the way, we are coming to you, we won't, I'm thinking about using a background. Since it is the Ides of March, you can't really see Caesar getting stabbed in this painting though, so it's not as good. So that's the guy, Julius Caesar, who obviously was stabbed to death on this day, March 15, 44 BC. Why is Donald Trump isolating the United States while wanting to be a global policeman? He's doing that kind of double crossing his own agenda. He wants to create a more isolationist America while also trying to intervene in the Middle East and things like that. Could cryptocurrency make currencies more controlled, like against the original intention? Yes, probably because they're digitalized. I mean, the 1920s Act changed history. We went from a rule-led society to an independent, intellectual, and moral society, I suppose. I don't know what 1920s Act you're referring to. So there's the man of the hour, Julius Caesar himself in all of his glory, one of the most successful generals in Roman history, who was later stabbed by many of his own friends and colleagues because they believed he was going to make himself dictator for life, which threatened their very existence and the existence of the Republic. The senators believed that they were acting on the behalf of the Roman Republic and for the good of the people, but the truth of the matter is they had their own interests and money that were threatened by Caesar gaining more power for himself and taking away their land and titles. Is it true Julius Caesar not raped by strangers? That's what Andrew Tate said. That sounds like something Andrew Tate would say, and I don't pay any attention what Andrew Tate says. Oh, the women the right to vote and work. Well, that's not the 1920s Act. That's the 18th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote in 1920. The 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave women the right to vote just in time for the 1920s election, and they actually voted overwhelmingly for Warren Harding, partly because he was such a handsome devil and very charming and had a reputation with the ladies, especially if you ask his wife, who probably poisoned him because of all of his philandering. But the truth of the matter is, women started to go out into the labor force. Then it really kicked up after World War II, and then the 1960s, women liberation, the feminine mystique of Betty Friedan, the feminist movement really encouraged women to fulfill themselves in work and occupation before, if not completely, they would fulfill themselves with home life and domesticated life. He was stabbed 23 times, of only 5 times while he was alive, and they were all stuck-up aristocrats like Caesar, somewhat cared about his people. Yes, there was the populares versus the optimates, which had been a divisive force in the Roman Republic for some time, and Caesar was a populare. He wanted to rule based on the will of the people, and this is where we get the term populist from, basically giving the people what they wanted while sitting in the throes of government, as opposed to the optimates, who were the conservatives, who maintained control over the government and tried to get everything and tried to secure their own political power and rely on the political processes and the esteem of the Roman Senate and Assembly to keep them from losing any of their power or estates. Thank you, Fink, again. You have retained much by joining us today, hopefully. Do you think the Monroe Doctrine was good? Yes, Harry. It's an incredible one of my favorite presidents is indeed James Monroe. And I think that it is a powerful statement of America's. It's the first statement that America ever makes for the rest of the Western Hemisphere. So Monroe had the guts to do this without worrying about what would happen if he did it. He spoke. It's the first time the United States ever spoke for the entire Western Hemisphere, and Monroe was happy to do it. Let me see here. I'm gonna get a nice. I have a painting of it for my background, since we're talking about it. Let me see. Yeah, so the Monroe Doctrine, obviously, James Monroe, written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, but basically in 1823, in order to keep the British from going into South America, the Americans agreed to wrote the Monroe Doctrine and issued it, proclaiming that the northern and southern continents of America were not open for colonization. The Western Hemisphere was not a colonizing ground for the Europeans anymore. This was a hard lesson for the Europeans to learn, as the French, 40 years later, would go in and try to put a French puppet, Maximilian, the Duke of Austria, the Archduke of Austria, in charge of Mexico with his wife Carlotta, and they were eventually killed by the Mexican people in a revolution. And the reason the United States could not enforce the Monroe Doctrine and keep France out keep the French and the French Foreign Legion out of Mexico was because they were in the midst of their own civil war. I did an entire video about the French Empire in Mexico, so go check that out when you're done with this. So, yeah. So the truth of the matter is the Monroe Doctrine is an incredible document because it's the first time the United States spoke on behalf of the North and Southern continents for the New World and telling the Old World to stay in their hemisphere, and that the Western Hemisphere would be American, from then on out, more and more as time went on, especially in rapid development during the 20th century, become America speaking as a hegemonic force of unity and control in both of the continents without anyone asking them to do so in a very American way. Why did Adolf use Buddhist peace signs as his logo? That wasn't a Buddhist peace sign. It was actually, what I was going to say is, it wasn't a Buddhist sign. It was actually a Hindu sign that was turned upside down. The Hindu sign meant peace and harmony. The upside down version was chaos and disorder. It's also a hooked cross, meaning you bend the sides of the cross backwards to represent, again, profanation of religious ideas. What do you think will happen to the population after the elder age peaks in this country? Well, in any country when that happens, a generation that has a very high birth rate, like the boomers in the United States and Britain, for instance, when they start to die off, the population will decline rapidly, and that's what's happening. The birth rate in the United States is dropping, as it is in many of the Western countries, and as the boomer generation, the largest generation in human history, starts to die off, we're going to see a reduced amount of the population. So the population will actually start to stall and then go backwards. America got to 300 million people when I was a kid, and now it's at 340. The rate has significantly decreased. It was at 330 just a few years ago. Why is history taught so terribly in schools? Because people who teach history in schools aren't passionate about it, hopefully. Or that's probably the main reason. And self-studying is less interesting. Yeah, you got to really love what you do and love the topic. Even though it was completely unenforceable, and if Spain or France or the UK had invaded South America or Central America, there was very little the US could do about it. And yet they really didn't. So that should tell you something. Harsonet, do you agree with my top 5 presidents? Coolidge, Monroe, Lincoln, Washington, Eisenhower? No. And you know that I don't agree because I'm going to have Lincoln on top. I'm probably going to have Washington second. I don't know if I put Monroe in the top 5. I don't know about Coolidge. I do think Monroe is a very underrated president. The 3 presidents I say to check out because they're underrated are Monroe, McKinley, and James Polk. And Polk is obviously the guy who fulfills Manifest Destiny, wins the Mexican-American War, which I talk about in my video as well, and takes us from sea to shining sea. And pretty well-accomplished president. He did that all in only one term. But I'd say Washington, I got to do a tier list, and that'll make it fun. I'd say Lincoln, Washington, oh boy, this is where it gets tough. Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not going to put Eisenhower in the top 5. I'm not going to put FDR in the top 5 because I really don't like FDR. Kennedy. That's a stable group. I don't think that Lyndon Johnson or FDR are top 5 presidents. So, yeah. Well, Britain was in favor of recognizing the South American countries and was the country who enforced the Monroe Doctrine the majority of the time. Thanks to, well, even though the Monroe Doctrine was written to keep Britain out of South America. And which is why Britain only got British Guyana as their only colony in South America. What is my IQ? Linda's asking. I don't know exactly. I've never taken an IQ test. I would hope that it's relatively high. Caleb, great to see you. I just got here. Wait, as soon as I get here, you're talking about the swastika. I have family members that died in camps in World War III. I'm very sorry to hear that. And by the way, Caleb is rightly identifying that there have been 3 world wars, and the one with the Nazis and the Japanese was indeed World War III. So thank you very much for that, Caleb. But I am very sorry for that. And I was only talking about that because Clorox was asking a really great question about the Nazi symbol and where it comes from, and I was explaining that it is an upside-down Hindu symbol. We're born 1999. I'm not going to tell you when I was born. Clorox, I want to impress the ladies with some educational history. What do you recommend? Oh, well, obviously tell them to like and subscribe to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, except the problem is, just like this, I'm kind of a catch, so it's going to be hard for them to keep their eyes on you. Educational history. What do you mean by educational history? Are you saying like places to go? Because you can, again, tell them to subscribe here. There's History Matters, Tea Time with Lindsay. Do you mean the history of education itself? Because I can talk a little bit about that. Well, I really appreciate that. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm going to put that as our pinned message for today. You're so nice. Texas Repo, what do you know about the Suez Canal and what's happening there? I don't know what's happening right now. I haven't heard anything, but the Suez Canal was built by the French. The British took control of it because they were the ones colonizing Egypt, and the Egyptians reasserted control of it when Gamal Abdel Nasser liberated Egypt and took over, creating a military dictatorship, and the Israelis, the French, and the British tried to retake it in 1956, and along with the Soviet Union, the United States actually helped the Egyptians keep it in control of the Egyptian people. So very interesting stuff. Thoughts on the Civil War slave hush harbors? Were they beneficial? I don't know much about them, so I can't say. Harry, well, look at what Britain did to France in 1823 regarding the Spanish colonies. What did Britain do to France regarding the Spanish colonies? Spain was losing all of its colonies by 1823. By 1823, Mexico was free, Colombia was free, Peru was free. By 1826, the Pan Americans were first meeting for the first time, as many of the Central and Southern American countries had already gone free. 1822, Brazil goes free from the Portuguese. Right. So by the time Monroe writes the Monroe Doctrine, or actually presents and declares the Monroe Doctrine, written by his Secretary of State, the future President John Quincy Adams, son of a founding father, and second President John Adams, the creator of the American Navy, by the time Monroe presents this document to Congress and reads it out as a speech, it is very, very clear that the Europeans are losing their imperial power in South America because Spain has lost its huge empire. The British are starting to try to get involved, and there's this reconfiguration. And Monroe speaks for the Southern American continent and says they aren't open for business, so go away. And other than Napoleon III going into Mexico in the midst of a civil war, there really isn't much that they can do. In fact, one of the reasons the Mexicans were able to fend off the French Foreign Legion was after the Civil War, the Americans began sending aid to the Mexican Republicans led by President Benito Juarez. And in 1867, they defeated Maximilian and Napoleon. Go and watch my video about that to learn more. Random fact, there was a president head statue tourist attraction, and they got abandoned, and the Lincoln one fell backwards and cracked a hole in its head, so that was a crazy coincidence. That is a crazy coincidence, and it reminds me of Futurama with the presidential heads. One of my favorite shows, by the way. Caleb, am I the youngest person who is a viewer of the channel? I was born in 2010. Wow, you're only 15, 14 joining us. I'm so appreciative that somebody from a young generation, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, Cusper, is with us. I am Cusper, I'll say that myself. If America ever were to fall into chaos, every state, would you cry? No. I would cry over Florida because Harsonet believes that's where I'm from. So we're going to go from Florida since that's where Harsonet believes that I'm from. We threatened France to go to war if they ceased the Spanish colonies, and Britain was more liked by the South American countries for a long time, as Britain founded a lot of them and was a huge commercial power, whilst America was an expansionist power, especially regarding the Caribbean and Central America, which is interesting because America did not have colonies in that region until the 1890s, and the nation of Panama was created by the Americans funding rebels in Colombia. So that's not fully true. Oh, you were born in 2010. That's amazing. It's incredible how much knowledge you have about your own country. I salute that, even if I don't always agree. And so, but the truth of the matter is, Harry, that's only partly true. It is true. The British were very well respected and did a lot of good in different parts of the world. Never said that they didn't. I don't know who Philip Schuler is. Spark. I don't know what that is. Talk about. You mean Nazis? NZ Nazis? You mean the Nazi Germans? The National German Socialist Workers' Party, founded in the early 20s, led by Adolf Hitler, created the Third Reich, did horrible atrocities and violated human rights, killed 11 million people, and then propelled Germany and the rest of the world into a terrible world of war that killed tens of millions of people. Oh, no, New Zealand. So New Zealand is originally populated by the Maori civilization. They're very well known for their face tattoos, usually that cover the bottom half or top side of their faces. It almost looks like a henna tattoo. And they were eventually, I forget the name of the treaty, but in the 1840s, the British made a treaty with them that basically signed away their rights to the British and allowed the British to control their foreign policy. And eventually it was colonized, and New Zealand became part of the British Empire and part of their dominion and control in Australia in the southeastern Pacific, or southwestern Pacific, rather. No, but America is the only country to refuse to sign a self-denial order regarding Cuba, giving off the entirely correct impression they wanted, which is interesting because they didn't colonize Cuba, and Spain had already colonized Cuba. The United States set Cuba free from the Spanish, and then used the Cubans as an economic cash cow for tobacco and sugar. Do you think another enlightenment is happening right now on the internet? I think that, I don't know if I would go so far to say that. The Enlightenment is a long-reaching thing, but there is definitely a lot of different movements on the internet, and the internet makes it more like a government. And yes, Waitangi. I did a video about the Treaty of Waitangi, Sparkle Farts, so you're in the right place. Caleb, how come they don't know how David Crockett died? They don't know if he was executed or killed in battle, because he died at the end of the siege of the Alamo when Santa Anna de Lopez, the Mexican dictator, was able to finally overwhelm the Texas forces that were resisting the Mexicans and saving time for Sam Houston to gather the forces he needed, which would eventually lead to the final victory for the Texans at the Battle of San Jacinto, where they were crying out, "Remember the Alamo." Crockett was the leader of the American forces there, along with Stephen Austin and Jim Bowie, who was extremely ill at the time. But Crockett they don't know exactly how he died because there's not many records of that left, and only a couple of people were allowed to walk free from there. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, I'm from Canada. Oh, Caleb, that's really cool, from Canada. Do you agree? I love it. We have people from all over the world coming. We have people from Finland and Russia and Canada and India joining this American broadcast, and I just really appreciate that. How did Canada become a country? So obviously Canada, during the First World War in the 1750s, the British were eventually able to defeat the French and their Indian allies and seize large portions of Canada and continue their expansion all the way to the western coast by the 1840s. In fact, the British claimed large sections of the northwestern Pacific, including Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho, well into the 1840s. It was finally in 1847 or 46 the agreement was made to settle the parallel at the 49th longitude, which is what separates Washington State from British Columbia. But basically, the Canadians, later in the 1800s, the Dominion system came into effect, and Canada was one of the first to become a Dominion country because where the British gave them basically the ability to self-govern while determining their foreign policy, and they paid fealty and loyalty to the British Queen. To this day, they are still interlocked in diplomatic relations, so that if the Great Britain is ever attacked or goes to war, if Great Britain is ever attacked, Canada is obligated to defend it. It wasn't until the 1980s, I believe, that there were finally agreements made that gave Canada basically its full and complete independence, or 1960s, I think. Let me see here. Do you agree the United States is the best country in history? I don't know if history has best countries. I mean, what do you mean by best? Most moral, most interesting? Well, if you're talking about wealth, power, and influence, obviously the United States wins proportional to other empires. It's a fascinating study because the United States has never really been an empire, but its hegemonic influence beyond its borders and the amount of land it controls, because it really doesn't have that many territories. It controls several small, satellite territories. Nothing like what Rome or Greece or the Mongols ever controlled, but its hegemonic influence is huge over Western Europe, Japan, and parts of Africa. So the United States obviously has a bigger hegemonic and global influence than many of the empires in world history, the largest and most successful one being the British. So the British Empire, I would say, historically speaking, has been the best empire or country in the world, most successful. The United States has become the wealthiest, the strongest ever seen, though, despite not having nearly the amount of land or population control that the British did. 1982, yep, the Canada Act. Again, because one Central and South America were more in favor of Britain, and if America had done that, they would have been fully isolated in the Americas. Possibly, interestingly enough, but I don't think that's what kept America isolated. I think America got involved because of the imperialist march in the 1800s of building an empire, and that's what brought them into the Spanish-American War, which is where they got Cuba its independence, acquired the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and Guam. These splendid little wars, it's called. What's the most moral country in history? Oh, that's a great question. That's a hard one to answer because you can't, it's almost like saying who's the least immoral, because no country's really moral. Countries do all sorts of horrible atrocities to each other. And while I've had people on this channel insisting that the Native Americans were the victims of a genocide, which is war crimes, maybe, dispossession, even ethnic cleansing, yes, but genocide, no. I don't believe that Native Americans were victims of genocide, and I stand by that, even though a lot of people disagree, and they have every right to disagree. The United States has done horrible things. I mean, you have that. You have the horrible treatment of the natives after the Indian Wars. You have slavery. You have discrimination. You have all of these things. But modern complaints about all of that tend to ignore the fact that that was the case in almost every civilization and society in human history. And so what has been the most moral country in history? It's a fantastic question, Woa. But I would say I think it's the least immoral, and it's hard for me to look as a historian at a particular country and say what they did around the world was pretty good for the rest of the people around them. I mean, I think of, I go to Britain, I go to France, I go to the United States. Western countries were the ones that got rid of slavery. Western countries were the ones that gave gay people the right to get married first. Western countries were the ones that emancipated women. You don't have that in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia like you do in the United States. You also have horrifying genocides in Eastern Europe that really cloud those countries from being more moral. If you want the least anti-Semitic country in history, in Europe at least, it's Poland, for instance. But there are shrouds and countries here and there that have done pretty moral things. But if you look at their entire historical canon, it's very hard to find a moral country, quote unquote. But I would have to say the United States is in that running, if that's what you're wondering. 1986 for Australia and New Zealand, and 1964 for South Africa. Yep, that's when they left it to the Boers to continue apartheid, Harry. Thank you very much for that. I now know the exact years. And yes, Spartacus is right. Please consider liking and subscribing if you're enjoying what we're talking about. Do you agree that the United States ideology and how it has been ran is the best in the world in history? Yes, although that ideology is shifting and has sometimes been very detrimental. Squirrel. Greetings, great to see you from across the pond once again, just like Harry. The United Kingdom became an empire because of American assistance with finance, investments, and ideologies. Partly true, but not definitely true. Do the winners write history, or is that a false statement? The winners often write history, but we have modern types of history, like History from Below, that share the experiences of people who were not. And if I have a Substack article, I have a Substack and Patreon with bonus content if you want to check those out. And Substack has my articles, which have more in-depth thoughts and a little more articulately than a live stream. But the truth of the matter is, Clorox, the winners, I wrote an entire Substack about how the winners don't always write history, and that History from Below, which just criticizes majority white societies, the United States, Western Europe, aren't very fair because they don't tell the story of the indigenous peoples who were oppressed and disenfranchised, or of African slaves, or of women, or stuff like that. They just kind of complain about the native countries, which I don't think is fair. So Winners do often write history, but we do get history from below, which tells us more. And I think that more and more we're seeing, I think we have to come to, um, we have to come to an understanding that the truth of the matter is that that history is often written by the victors, but history is, there's a level of consensus, there's facts that are reported, and you can synthesize that from both sides. And the more sources you have attesting it, even from differing opinions and perspectives, the more likely you are to have a cohesive history. So I don't like the phrase that winners write history, because there is some truth to it, obviously, but that doesn't mean that history is totally unreliable, because there are things that are written by both sides, and there are consensus facts that we can agree upon. The historiography, the interpretation of those events, are often what's up for debate. The Aztecs and many other natives made skull walls and were cannibals. Yes, that's very true. The Aztecs did horrible things. I was just reading a story about an Aztec chieftain who invited a local tribe, I forget the name of the tribe, and said that he wanted to make the chieftain's daughter a goddess. And the chieftain agreed to this. And later on, the native brought back his, let me see here. I'm going to put up something else here as my background. And later on, the native the native chief returned a couple months later to see that the priest of the Aztec people was wearing his daughter's skin as a suit. And the reason he was wearing her skin as a suit is because they believed that in order to make her a goddess, they had to kill her and peel off her skin. And they wore it as a almost like an animal pelt. So it was barbaric, it was disgusting, it was awful, some of the things that the natives did to each other, and some of the things the Europeans did to each other as well. And that horror at that and human sacrifice is what made Cortez rally the different native tribes, like the Zapotecs and Toltecs, and destroy the Aztecs in the 1520s, which is pictured here, the fall of Tenochtitlan, which was rebuilt as Mexico City. So there you see a very small Aztec force, very small Spanish force of conquistadors allied with natives to destroy the Aztecs. And the Aztecs would basically siphon off as many people from these other tribes as they possibly could, thus reducing their manpower, and use that as tribute and sacrifice them to their gods. What do you know about the Black Tom event in 1916? I don't know, in New York. I don't know what that is exactly. America didn't steal land from the natives, they conquered it. People get that wrong. I don't know how I feel about that. Dispossessing them and forcing them onto reservations does seem like stealing. At the same time, yes, the natives lost wars with the Americans, which meant they lost land. And everyone in history before them, when they lost wars, they usually lost either money or land or both. And so it's not necessarily a new feature when they lost their land. Random fact, Mark Twain was born when a comet was passing Earth the same night, and he died the same night if it came back and passed the Earth many years later, and he predicted he'd die with it too. Well, that would be Halley's Comet, of course. I believe that's probably Halley's Comet, because it's about 75. How old was I in 2006? Younger than I am now. Harry, you could argue Britain kept its empire longer because of the U.S., but we would have had our empire, and we wouldn't have had the same great empire with or without the United States. It just would have lasted less time. Well, yeah, that's true, but the British Empire, despite many of its failings, the British had the resources, supplies, and manpower to withstand the Nazis and all of that nonsense because of their empire. So the British Empire, for all of its failings, had to exist in order to destroy the Nazis and Imperial Japan. 32, if you had to guess. Interesting guess. As you being a historian yourself doesn't make good money. If you subscribe, it'll make good money. I know you're subscribed, but if people subscribe and we're able to get off the ground here, then yes, it'll make plenty of good money. Harry, do you think Oliver Cromwell was good or just a person who was a tyrant who replaced another tyrant? I think he had good motives, but the path to hell is paved with good intentions, and I think he was very dictatorial and became more and more so. You see how cruelly he treated the Irish when he invaded Ireland in the 1650s. He's a pretty nasty guy at times. I did an entire live stream lecture about Oliver Cromwell, and an interesting figure he is. Do you think the dystopian movie, and I did a recent Substack where I wrote about the English Civil Wars and how there's about 4 of them, in my opinion. So you might want to check out that article, Harry. Whoa, do you think the dystopian movies from the 90s and 2000s are more relevant today? I think The Matrix might be because of simulation, AI, virtual reality, stuff like that is becoming more and more popular. What's the difference between Aztecs and the natives? The Aztecs were one tribe of natives who lived in Mexico, and the Native Americans that are usually referenced are the ones that fought the United States, such as the Sioux Nation, like tribes like the Lakota or the Cheyenne in the plains, or the Pueblo in the south, or the Nez Perce in the northwest. There's a theory that the Aztecs are originally from India. Interesting. There's a lot of theories about where the native groups came from. Many people believe they came from Polynesia and Macaronesia, as well as Asia itself, and adapted to the climate and environment of North and South America. You know, natives also sold and had their own slave trade. You make natives sound like saints, and Europeans massacred them. Yeah, I just literally went into great detail about how horrible the Aztecs were, and yes, most Native American tribes that fought in the Civil War fought on the side of the Confederacy to keep their own slaves, and they were dealing in slaves long before blacks ever came to the North American continent. The Black Tom explosion, a major act of sabotage by German agents in 1916, involved a series of explosions at a munitions depot on Black Tom Island in New York Harbor, damaging the Statue of Liberty. Though that's fascinating. I did not know that. So thank you, Squirrel, for telling me about that. I'll have to look into it more. Otter Poop, great to see you. Long time. But yes, we had an empire that defeated the Nazis, and the USSR destroyed it. Oh yeah, well, yeah. That's you and I have gone back and forth on that. In real life, are you an actual historian who does research or something? I'd like to be. I'd like to do more of that, to be sure. It's the first ever attack on U.S. soil. Interesting, Squirrel. Thank you for sharing that with me. Britain fought the Japanese during World War II, but had little success. The Americans into World War II. They did, and the Japanese were determined to fight through Burma and get to India, and that was what the British were terrified of, and they actually helped the Chinese and Mao, of all people, fight the Japanese. America also turned up 2 years late. You mean 4 years late, because the war really starts in 1937, so Britain turned up 2 years late. So, like, how do you make money? I teach. I've talked about this before. And look at that. I've actually caught up to the chat, believe it or not. Really great questions from a lot of great people like Arsenet and Harry and Caleb talking about some really fun historical things, and I really appreciate that. I teach, and that's how I pay rent. Yep. Is the image from 1450, is the image from 1453, Fall of Constantinople? No, this is, if in the rivers give it away, this is Tenochtitlan. I'm going to move aside so you guys can see that a little bit better. That is the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 at the hands of Hernan Cortez. Yes, teach students. And that is when the Aztecs were destroyed by the Spanish and their Indian rivals, Indian allies. Why did America show up late to 2 world wars? I wouldn't say that they showed up to, yes, high school, middle school, take your pick. Why did America show up late to 2 world wars? It's an interesting concept that they showed up late. They didn't want to get involved in the First World War. There's 3 world wars. Again, 3, not 2. But the Second World War, the Great War, the First World War as you might call it, is because the main reason they show up late there is because at first they didn't want to get involved in what they deemed as a European conflict, because all of the Europeans were fighting each other, the Europeans that started, and were just using their colonies all throughout the world to continue fighting. Japan, China, were involved in it too, but you also had Indians fighting in the trenches. You had fighting in Africa between the German and French and British colonies. So there's a lot going on there. The truth of the matter is America joins because the Germans would not stop sinking their ships, and because of America's closer ties in history and culture to the English. In the Third World War, the United States did not want to join because FDR did not want to get was worried about the Great Depression and fixing the American economy there. But when he agreed to the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, he basically signed on America to fight for the Allies. And it was only a matter of time then when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. High school. Do you know Squirrel is saying, do you know the Persians created a dog line that fought only elephants and gave them to Rome? That sounds about right. A hybrid dog line created by the Persians, almost like a Griffith. Yep. They do. They definitely do, Arsenet. Ryan, great to see you. And yes, Ryan is right. Becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as liking and subscribing. For everyone, Battlefield 1 is World War II according to Friendly History, and Battlefield 5 is World War III, and 2025 World War IV. Yes, I believe that there are 3 world wars, and if there's another one that breaks out, there will be a 4th one. Yeah, the Japs did get the Yanks really mad. Well, that is mainly because FDR knew it was probably going to happen, or there was some sort of attack coming, and putting in an oil embargo is what made the Japanese mad, and they retaliated by attacking Pearl Harbor. So I do historical hot takes every day where I analyze something and kind of put my own twist on it, and that's definitely one. The United States, I don't want to not memorialize the loss of that many men at Pearl Harbor was an awful travesty, the worst attack in American history until 9/11. But the truth of the matter is the Americans knew what they were getting into when they put the oil embargo on the Japanese. Are there any of them who are in the live stream now? No. Can you explain the background of the stream? I just got here. So we were talking about the Aztecs and natives, and this is the Cortez conquering Tenochtitlan. You can get, and the rivers give it away, the city built on the rivers. Obviously, it starts with the famous eagle sitting on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, and that becomes the symbol of on the Mexican flag, and that is where Tenochtitlan starts and where Mexican civilization technically starts according to ancient myth. But this is when Cortez in 1521 or 1522 destroys the Aztecs with the help of local tribes like the Zapotecs, who were being enslaved and often sacrificed by the very same brutal Aztecs. What's the history of corporate America? Well, corporate America really emerges after the Civil War at a huge rate with men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, James Duke, the robber barons, and men who put their name on universities. Cornell is another one of them, by the way. Dartmouth, but of course, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. These people all establish huge corporate empires that rely on the work of low-paid workers who are usually immigrants and even child labor in order to make them as wealthy and prosperous as they possibly can. So, have you seen these banana? So the history of corporate. So it starts there, and it kind of develops, and eventually the federal government gets in and says that corporations can't control the sale of only one good or the sale of all the products related to one goods. Those are known as monopolies and trusts, respectively. And so by the early 20th century, presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt broke down oil companies and broke up corporations. They passed antitrust legislation and enforced it that forced a lot of these corporations to break down into smaller companies. They forced them to make clean sanitation. The stratification of labor, the development of the assembly line allowed for more people to make more money and to work at different parts, and it made goods cheaper thanks to people like Henry Ford. So corporate America really took off from there, and so modern corporate America really emerges during and after World War III in the 40s, after the Great Depression, with workers working in a factory and making money, better money than they used to, having a minimum wage or better than that based on their skills and experience, and 9 to 5 and all of that stuff. Have you seen these Banana Republic things? No, I have not. I don't know what you're referring to. Did it snow for you this winter? Not going to answer. L natives, Q manifest destiny, W manifest destiny. That's true. Why is London Bridge so boring now? Because it's not falling down. Hitler was apparently supposed to be an anti-animal abuse vegetarian guy and has advocated against human zoos, which was stupid because when the Russians invaded Berlin. Well, yeah, the Germans attached the grenades to dogs to explode the Russians. Yes, that is true. I have heard that. Well, the human zoos were the way they struck out and condemned imperialism, because human zoos were something the British and French had done, basically putting on display these exotic creatures who were human beings from Africa and Asia. Duck pics everywhere. Yusma is saying, do you believe the early South American visitors from Europe spread diseases there and the Amazon forest is simply vegetation coming from... I don't think that's the case. I think the Amazon was there before then. The tribes that have lived there and kind of more isolated things were very used to their surroundings and things like that. The spreading of diseases was absolutely one of the major causes. That's why I don't believe it's the genocide of Native Americans, because the death of the Native American people is mainly through usually unintended disease spreading from the Europeans. Who doesn't like ducks? FDR didn't have a clue the Japs would attack. Thank goodness the American people rallied and finished the war. I have read recently that FDR did know that there was something coming. Not necessarily what it would be, but yes. And all swans are indeed owned by the king. Also, Hitler signed a paper to stop human zoos, but that's stupid since he ran one of the biggest human zoos in history, aka the Holocaust. Yes, irony. Is history linear or cyclical? It's linear for now. We'll see what happens next. What party supported the Confederates? Okay, Harson, here we go. Yes. Technically speaking, in history, the Democratic Party is the party of the Confederacy, KKK, Jim Crow. All of that stuff was originally created by the Democratic Party, but it's not exclusive. But that does not mean that racism or segregation was exclusive to the Democratic Party or to the American South. Oregon was the first state to have discrimination laws after the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, basically enshrined, where you had segregation all over the state. And that's Oregon, which was a free state that fought for the Union and was run by Republicans in the 1860s. How does it relate to the history of the stock market? Well, the corporate America is obviously some of the biggest names in corporate America helped build the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street to its heights, helped create the modern stock market system, the modern buying system. I've just been reading that during the Great Depression, Rockefeller and a bunch of these other guys, when Black Tuesday and Black Friday hit, when these huge plummets in the stock market happened, they were doing everything they could to buy up as much stock as they possibly could. Yes, that's definitely true. Isometric patterns of projection everywhere. The first stock exchange was in Amsterdam, of all places. Well, that makes sense, Harry, because Amsterdam and the Dutch were extremely lucrative and economically wise people, and they were pretty commercially successful during the 17th century. Where was the first natives that became? Where are the first natives that became Christians? It all depends what you're talking about. I would argue that the first natives who became Christians were Greeks and Turkish people converted by St. Paul in the first century. If you're referring to natives here in America, I believe that would be in the Caribbean under the Spanish. Squanto had been, I don't know if he was a practicing Christian, but he had been exposed to Catholicism because he had been taken by the Portuguese and had learned English, and that was how he was able to communicate with the Plymouth Rock settlers. Let me see. Do you think the Swiss companies that sell gold bullions like PAMP actually use gold from World War III or World War II? Yes. There is evidence that the Swiss were very good at taking care of Nazi banking, and that's why Hitler did not invade them. Yeah, Caleb, it's not something people know. It was the Democrats were the party of slavery. Now, there is a theory amongst more liberal-thinking people that in the 1960s, because the civil rights movement was so profoundly supported by the left, that the parties switched. That in the 60s, the Democrats from the South, the conservatives who wanted to preserve segregation and discrimination, became Republicans, and the people in the North who had been in favor of civil rights left the old Republican Party that was becoming too conservative and became liberal Democrats. Not true. At least not fully true. There's probably some nuance and somewhere in the middle, but the truth of the matter is many of the old Democrats in the South who were racist Democrats, like Robert Byrd, remained Democrats until their death. There was only one major Democratic lawmaker who switched his parties, and that was Strom Thurmond. The South continued to be a battleground between Republicans and Democrats until the Reagan administration, where Reagan basically cleaned house in the 1980s, and a newer, less racist generation of people emerged who were much more conservative, who were raised in the shadow of the civil rights movement. Discrimination in the South is still very prevalent and common, but it is actually selective, based on intention from both sides of the aisle, both blacks and whites choosing to discriminate and segregate from one another freely without compulsion by the state government. It was also the Democrats who supported slavery. I'm Labor, not Democrat. Fair point. Hey, Running Man, good to see you. What's the history of my mustache? Well, my razor went bad, so I need a new razor. Was Black Friday made to sell slaves? No. Why did the Muslims impose the jizya tax? So this is good. I did a video, Harsonet, recently great question, about the rise of Islam, and I did an article about it. I did a live stream lecture about it, and the jizya was imposed on people of the book, Christians and Jews, who the Muslims believed were good people who should not be forced to convert to Islam. So in order to avoid converting to Islam, they either had to serve in the Muslim army or pay a tax. And this happened throughout the history of the Islamic states, known as caliphates. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, even the Ottoman Empire did this. And so basically, Christians either served in the Muslim army or paid taxes, or they were forced to convert, or they were persecuted and killed. And that happened all the time. And so it was imposed to raise money for the state. It was a tribute, but it was a way to punish people for not being Muslim while still respecting their right to practice their own religion. It was a very, very rudimentary and often lucrative way to be religiously tolerant. The Netherlands from above is the head of a beaver. It was made by the Masons for the financial system. Beaver live in lodges too, like the Mason. Okay. Do you think the UK and France should play a bigger role in the world today? I think they have for a very long time, and France is now trying to do that more so that the United States is backing off of European affairs. We'll see what that looks like. It looks like Stramer and Macron are very much on board with them playing a bigger role. I don't know if they don't have the influence and power they used to is the only issue. So they don't have the resources available that they did 80 years ago to stop global conflicts. Your opinion about Hitler escaping in 1945, also how long would he have lived with Parkinson's? It is possible that Hitler had Parkinson's, the early onsets of Parkinson's, which was affecting his horrible mood swings and his pill taking near the end of the war. I don't think he escaped. I think he died in that basement. But there were Nazis who escaped to South America. Adolf Eichmann is an example. The Jews were able to hunt him down and bring him back to Israel and kill him. Operation Finale is an excellent historical movie about that. But Joseph Mengele, whose birthday is tomorrow, actually survived and lived out a full life in Argentina. No one ever found him. Now, not to bring it's probably Argentina. Not to bring political views into this, but Texas Repo is clearly a Trumpy dumpy Trumpster. Okay, well, I've been called a Trumpy dumpy Trumpster, and I've been called a Trump hater and a bigot and a racist and all these things. I've been called everything, left-wing nut job, right-wing bigot, all of that stuff. So I respect all political views, and we are a free speech absolutist platform. You can say whatever you want, even if you disagree with me, because that's what we're here for. That's why we have people who come in here with like openly anti-Semitic views, and I don't care. I let them stay. I argue with them because good ideas versus bad ideas must be able to go back and forth. It's the way the world works. Do you think the current administration is falling prey to Hegelian theory? I don't know yet. We'll see how incendiary and us versus them it really becomes. Do you think Elon Musk will be assassinated? No. Caleb, yeah, so what? What are you going to do about it? Apparently he's not going to do anything. We're on the internet. So that's the thing. You can say things and throw barbs and grenades at each other, theoretically speaking, and nothing can be done. The compulsory charity Muslims used to pay was higher than jizya. Yes, that is definitely true. That's the zakah. It is the fifth pillar of Islam. So you have Shahada, which is the affirmation, the credo, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. You have Salat, which is the prayer 5 times a day facing Mecca. You have I forget the Islamic name of the next two. One is the Hajj, the pilgrimage, is number 4. Number 3, I forget the name of, is fasting, especially during Ramadan, which is happening right now, by the way. And the 5th pillar is, of course, zakah, which is almsgiving that Muslims are forced to pay. Yes, it's true. It's like tithing almost. So go check out my video and my article on my Substack about about Islam's history, and you'll see more there. Well, Muslims don't believe in forced conversion, but the idea is if you don't convert, you're going to have to do something else, and that's where the jizya comes from. My kukum, which is grandma in a native language, I forgot which one, but the point is my kukum has two houses, one in Texas, one in Minnesota. Interesting. So you have American roots too. Your opinion about UFOs with anti-gravity tech? I'm sure I don't know about UFOs existing necessarily. Well, UFOs exist. It's two extraterrestrials. Are those the ones piloting them, or is this part of some sort of shadow government? We don't know. So Zakat is the 4th, and then the Hajj is the 5th. Okay, thank you for that. And when she gets pulled over in Texas, most cops in her city are Mexicans, so she just pretends to be Mexican. And in Minnesota, she just gets scared because most cops there are white. Interesting. So I'm assuming she is not fully white. Will be America's standards. I'm defo a left-wing nut job, especially with my views on healthcare and the economy. Well, yes. Well, the Brits, all European politics is diametrically to the left of American politics, only with the exception of these new right-wing movements like the Reform in Britain and the AfD in Germany. Those are even more to the right than the Republicans in the United States because it's a reactionary element, literally, to the Labor parties and the liberal parties and the Social Democrats. Fasting is 3rd, yep. They could only help each other Muslims who were poor of charity, not Christians. That is true from what I have read. They also could only enslave other Muslims, or non-Muslims. So I guess we are in the same camp. Are we? Are we not? I get called both. I don't reveal my political opinions. And if you watch my videos covering the 2024 presidential election, I try to be as objective as possible because I'm a historian analyzing what I believed was a historic election. Are you ready for the industrial age yap tomorrow? If you don't call it yap, then I'll be ready. Please mention cars and steam factories in the industrial age and steam factories. Well, yeah, definitely talk about the Industrial Revolution and how it gets started in Britain, goes to the United States, and then skips over to France. We got a lot to talk about tomorrow. It's going to be an interesting live stream. So I've got my first half hour dedicated to the Industrial Revolution, and then my second half hour I'll be talking about St. Patrick's Day and St. Patrick himself. So a lot of stuff. Yes, and there's social movements, trends, and politics the United States is behind, technically speaking. Oh, that's interesting about her ethnicity, Caleb. Anyways, we're coming up on an hour. We started late, so I've gone late, but I'm gonna thank you, Harsonet. I so appreciate you. Can you tell me why all the illegals are working at Amazon warehouse? I don't know where all the illegals are working. I'm not very privy to that information, where undocumented people are working in the United States. All right. Interesting. That's very interesting. So that would be Umar. That would be the 3rd caliph. Could you think about me being a mod? I can think about it. I'm not going to swear onto it. That's the one reason I can't be a historian. I'm very opinionated and not objective at all. That's fair. Many historians are just as opinionated or as much as you. The second was Umar. It's Muhammad, Umar, Uthman, and then Ali is the last one. And Hassan was supposed to be the next one, but then they got rid of Hassan. The Umayyads did. Watch my video on it. I'd go into detail about the early detailed history of Islam. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali. So Umar is the third. I'm counting Muhammad as one of them. How old is Haramoni in the Prisoner of Azkaban? I don't remember exactly. Yeah. Anyway, so it's been an hour. I'm going to take off. I hope you all have a great evening, and I'm going to try to get out of this hellscape that is around me right now and try to avoid getting killed by the conquistadors or the Aztecs if I can. And yes, Harsonet does a great job. He'd be a great mod. But so would you, Ryan. Thank you so much. Yeah. That's not how the Ottomans considered him. They considered Muhammad to be one of the five caliphs. Usma. So yes, it is true that you have Umar, Ali, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and then Hassan, his son. And because it was his son, Aisha starts the civil war, the Fatina. And after the Fatina, Muawiyah, the leader of Assyrians, takes over and establishes the Umayyads in Damascus. So yes, Usma. Yes, well, it's a caliphate. It's the head of the religious state in Islam. So they would consider him to be that. Yeah. Anyways, can you be an opinionated historian? And if you can, I don't think you would be a good one. You can be a good one, and you can be good at being opinionated. You just got to really back it up with a lot of facts and logic. So, interesting. Tim Hortons sing. Huh? Oh yeah, interesting. Sing Hortons. So someday I'll have to come up to Canada, and you'll have to show me Sing Hortons, Caleb. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Usma, I would be happy to see the references and stuff like that. I am saying if you look at, there's a tapestry, if you watch my video about it, there's a tapestry made by the Ottomans that actually has Muhammad listed as one of their caliphs. And the first successor to Muhammad is Abu Bakr, the first leader. So I can agree with that. And what is the time is the lecture Florida time? It is 4 p.m. tomorrow, Eastern Standard Time. As always, I use Eastern Standard here. So I'll see you guys then for my live stream lecture on the Industrial Revolution and on St. Patrick. Going to be a lot of fun. A two-parter about two different topics, but we'll have fun talking about them. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Enjoy your Saturday. Stay safe out there and love history. Bye now.